The studio lights flattered him. Tucker grinned like he'd already won. "Let's be honest, Michelle. You weren't elected. You were escorted." Laughter from the control booth. A smug sip from his coffee. Michelle didn't flinch. She simply reached beneath the table and placed a sealed crimson envelope between them. "Read it," she said. "Or I will." He opened it. 3 lines, 1 signature. His jaw locked. Voice stalled. The teleprompter kept rolling, but Tucker didn't. Gasps cracked like stained glass. The booth went silent. Michelle adjusted her mic, steady as judgment. Before diving into this extraordinary exchange, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful political moments the mainstream media won't show you. Tucker leaned into the table, hands steepled like a sermon in progress, eyes narrowed with calculated concern. The questions came with a rhythm, familiar and smug. "Don't you think it's dangerous to generalize about America? Why haven't you ever acknowledged how much this country gave you? Isn't it divisive to speak of injustice when you've clearly succeeded?" The framing was the trick. Not accusation, implication. Not outright disdain, plausible curiosity. He wasn't interrogating her. He was setting traps disguised as handshakes, hoping she'd step wrong in front of an audience already sharpening their knives. Michelle Obama sat with her hands folded, her face unreadable, as if sculpted from the same stillness she'd perfected. On campaign trails, in funerals, in rooms that doubted her presence before she even opened her mouth. She didn't blink. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked at him, like someone watching a fire that had already burned itself out. Behind the curtain of calm, a memory hovered. Her team, days before, in a prep room thick with caution. One staffer had leaned forward and said it plainly. "He's going to interrupt constantly." That's the play. She hadn't responded. She hadn't needed to. She'd been interrupted by bigger things than a man with a mic and a branded tie. Now, live and glowing under the unforgiving light of a prime time. "Studio," she waited. Tucker kept going, mistaking her stillness for hesitation. It wasn't. It was calculation, the kind learned by people who were never allowed the benefit of being merely unprepared. He finished another question, something laced with the phrase, personal grievance, masquerading as politics, and paused with that slight, performative smirk, expecting her to meet him in the theater of it all. She didn't. What she did instead made even the air hold its breath. She leaned back, let a full second pass, then said, quiet as smoke, "I've been questioned by systems better than this chair." No flinch, no sting, just truth, laid bare and surgical. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. One of the producers behind the camera shifted in his seat. Someone backstage took off their headset. Just for a moment. The temperature of the room dropped, not because the show lost control, but because it never had it in the first place. Tucker opened his mouth, but nothing followed. Not immediately. The smirk was still there, but dimmed, uncertain, like a signal trying to hold in bad weather. Michelle remained still. She wasn't playing host or guest or spectacle. She was playing history, and history never waits for permission. Michelle didn't raise her voice. She never had to. She began, as she often did, by naming what others circled. Not by arguing Tucker's point, but by undoing its foundation. She referenced his April 2022 segment, the one where he questioned whether empathy was making the country weak. She nodded, almost gently, toward the interview he gave just months ago in which he lamented the loss of cultural anchors, while platforming men who couldn't define what they meant by culture, or who they meant to exclude from it. The REG studio lights held steady, but something else began to flicker. A pulse behind the scenes. The audience at home might not have caught it at first, but they would on rewatch. How Michelle wasn't defending herself. She was mapping something. exposing the shape of the game by pulling at its seams in full view. She quoted a guest of his who once claimed, "Real Americans reject victim narratives," and asked calmly what that meant to the descendants of slaves, to families who watched, their homes redlined into silence, to mothers who bury sons twice, once to violence, and again when their names are dragged through the evening news. Tucker shifted in his seat. His pen, a prop he often twirled to perform ease, was now gripped tightly between thumb and knuckle. White, tense. Michelle didn't look at it. She didn't need to. The unraveling had already begun. She described watching his show while preparing for this appearance, how his questions changed based on the guest's skin, how his empathy was proportional to familiarity, how dissent, when spoken by someone who looked like her, was always reframed as resentment. And then, with a tone almost too calm to be confrontational, she lowered her voice just slightly. "You ask me to prove my belonging. I'm asking why. You fear it." There it was. Not an accusation. A mirror. The line didn't spike the volume. It spiked the blood pressure, not just in the room, but through the feed, into living rooms across the country. Viewers who had tuned in expecting a clash of personalities were now witnessing something else entirely. A woman refusing to fight on borrowed terms. A dismantling without spectacle. Tucker opened his mouth, and then closed it again. The pen remained frozen in his grip, a symbol of control he no longer possessed. His posture still tried to say host, but his eyes had betrayed him. Searching. Now, not for a counterpoint, but for footing. Michelle sat back, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't debating an idea. She was naming a fear, and once you name a fear on national television, it no longer owns the room. She could have stopped there, let the silence do the work. But Michelle had come not to respond. She had come to reclaim. And so, she shifted, no longer dissecting, no longer mapping contradictions. Now she stepped into something heavier, personal, a register deeper than debate. Her voice, still steady, dropped slightly, like a weight being set down gently on a table between them. "When you mock," she said, eyes level, "I remember the mothers who buried." Not just a sentence, a rupture. Something about the phrasing, the quiet certainty of it, reached beyond the set, beyond the studio, straight into the walls of homes where the volume on this show was usually loud enough to drown out doubt. Tucker blinked, for the first time, not in control, not irritated, not defensive, recognizing something, not because he understood it, but because it rang true before he could armor up against it. The red light on camera 1 flared as the operator adjusted mid-focus, unsure whether to stay tight on Michelle's face or cut to the reaction shot. The decision was made for them. The control room held the frame. Her stillness said more than a dozen cuts ever could. Michelle spoke of walking past memorials without plaques, of seeing candlelight vigils that never made it to cable, of how grief in certain zip codes was treated like weather. Seasonal, unchangeable, unimportant. She didn't list names. She didn't need to. Tucker's cue cards sat untouched on the desk before him, angles half-formed, questions rehearsed too many times to forget, and now useless. He glanced toward them, once, like someone realizing their map led to a place that no longer existed. He shifted again, tried to lean forward, the subtle body cue of a man about to interrupt, but the rhythm of the moment had shifted out of his control, and Michelle, sensing it, moved directly through the opening he hadn't yet found the words to close. Behind the camera, a stagehand raised a hand for break. The host across the desk reached toward the cue panel, his professional reflex to cut the segment, move on, reset the power balance. Michelle didn't stop. "I don't need more time," she said calmly. "I need your viewers to remember what you forgot." It wasn't a plea. It was a command dressed as grace. No one moved. The studio didn't breathe. The lights, hot overhead, cast a faint sheen on Tucker's brow now, but the sweat wasn't from temperature. It was recognition of a moment that would outlive the segment, that would replay in tweets, remixes, transcripts, but never in his favor. He had wanted a confrontation. What he got was history, made present, and irreversible. She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. Her cadence remained unshaken, paced like scripture, not to be debated, but absorbed. And when Michel repeated his own phrase back to him, the effect was seismic. "You once said," she began, eyes resting on him as if they'd been waiting there all along, "that we are losing the culture war because we've forgotten who we are." She let the words hang for a moment, just long enough for the audience to remember he had indeed said it, countless times, with that same performative gravitas. But in her mouth, the sentence became something else entirely. Not an alarm, a confession. "You haven't forgotten," she continued. "You've just mistaken your reflection for your enemy." Inside the studio, the control booth didn't dare cut away. A junior producer standing off stage, still holding a clipboard, slowly lowered it. The crew had gone still, their earpieces silent. Even the camera operators weren't adjusting anymore. They were witnessing something they'd never rehearsed for. Outside the studio building, where a small crowd had gathered to watch the segment. On a public screen feed, a low collective exhale rippled through the watchers. The kind that came not from surprise, but from the slow recognition of something finally being said that couldn't be taken back. Phones were already up. Clips were already hitting timelines. Back inside, Tucker's posture snapped forward, hand lifted like a paddle in an imaginary courtroom. "Let me finish," he muttered, voice coiled too tight, tone cracked slightly, with something he hadn't shown before. Not indignation, exposure. Michelle's reply landed like a closing door. "You already did." Silence again, but not empty. Full of every implication, every truth she'd reframed not as argument, but as reflection. One of the boom mic operators, barely breathing, whispered, "He lost it." And he had. Because now every follow-up Tucker attempted felt like it circled back to him. Each time he tried to steer the conversation away, pivot to talking points, accusations, statistics, she gently turned the wheel until he saw himself again. Not the version on the promos, not the headline maker, the one beneath it all, frantic behind the mask of certainty. Michelle recounted no political slogans. She didn't chase viral applause. Instead, she calmly mentioned the time he laughed as a guest dismissed redlining, the segment where a mother's grief was cut short for a commercial break, the way his show claimed to defend families, but only certain ones, only ones that looked the way he needed them to in order to sell fear as identity. Then she paused, tilted her head just slightly, not in disdain, but in the quiet knowing of someone who had already won something bigger than airtime. "You built a stage to corner me," she said. "I turned it into a mirror. And for the first time in years, the host of the hour didn't know where to look. The clip went viral before the segment even ended. It wasn't just trending, it was detonating. Twitter, no, X, lit up like a grid on fire. Threads ignited. TikToks spawned with black and white overlays and somber music. Influencers usually allergic to anything overtly political posted the ED quote in white Helvetica over muted backgrounds. Professors reposted it with a simple watch, then rewatch. Even a few prominent conservatives, long aligned with Tucker's platform, shared it without commentary, as if the words said more than any defense could. And all of it, every reaction, every seismic ripple, came from a single sentence, the one Michelle had rehearsed without ever saying aloud. In a flashback, days earlier, She sat alone in a darkened prep room. No aides, no binders, just her and a single piece of paper she never read from. Circling the words, reading them silently over and over, like a benediction, until they didn't sound like strategy anymore, until they just felt like truth. Back in the studio, Tucker was still staring. Not at her, not at the crowd, into the lens, because something had shifted that not even his production team could edit away. There were no commercial breaks left. No graphic overlays strong enough to rescue the frame. The oxygen had changed. The set still looked like Tucker Tonight, but it no longer belonged to him. The camera was rolling, but it wasn't his show. Michelle was closing her final statement. Now, her voice smooth, low, unhurried. She wasn't speaking to the man across from her anymore. She was speaking through the screen, to the audience, to the people who had felt cornered for decades by expectations, by frames, by men in suits with smirks that never bent. I didn't come here to trade performances, she said, her hands folded. I came here to remind you what gets buried when you turn politics into theater. Tucker blinked once, twice. His jaw tightened slightly. It was the only movement he made. I've spent a lifetime being told to speak up, but no one ever asked why I learned to go quiet. She paused, not for effect, but for space. Silence isn't weakness. It's the weight of knowing. And then, nothing. No counter. No applause. The studio lights didn't flicker, but they somehow felt dimmer. Not one person moved. Not even the stage manager who had, 5 seconds earlier, been waving for rap, Michelle. Didn't rise. She didn't smile. She simply let the stillness settle, like dust on marble. Outside, the clip was already looping. Subtitled, translated, screen recorded. It hit Instagram Reels and Discords. Reddit threads titled, Michelle ends Tucker with a whisper. Even those who hadn't seen the segment yet knew how it ended. Not with volume, not with flame, but with the kind of truth that doesn't trend because it's viral. It trends because it can't be unseen. There was an empty chair beside her, not a prop, not mentioned, just there, unclaimed, unremarked, and unavoidable. A blank space next to Michelle Obama that seemed to hum with absence. No one had asked about it, and no producer dared to move it. But the camera caught it each time it panned wide, and by now the viewers had noticed. The feeds noticed. The symbolism was loud. She never looked at the chair directly, but she did glance toward it once, as if remembering who should have been sitting there, or who no longer could. Then, without preamble, Michelle began. Her voice didn't rise, but the temperature in the room dropped. You say things like, we can't afford to coddle weakness. But what you never say is the names. The names of those who lived under policies you praised, who died under the silence you defended. She didn't name Tucker. She named the others. Names like Khalif Browder, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Matthew Shepard, Breonna Taylor. Names that never made it to Tucker's monologues unless they could be reframed. Names that only existed in his world as flashpoints, not as people. She didn't weaponize the stories. She carried them gently, precisely. And the weight of that care was louder than any confrontation. You talk about law and order, she said, eyes steady. But you never look at who the laws were written for, or who they were written against. Tucker shifted. He reached for a water bottle that was already open, forgot he had unscrewed it, and set it back down. His fingers tapped against the desk, then stopped. He didn't interrupt. He couldn't. The room wouldn't let him. Michelle paused again, but it wasn't hesitation. It was deliberate space-making, the kind you create when you're about to bury something that should have died long ago. This chair beside me, she said, still not turning toward it, is for the voices that don't make it into prime time. Not because they're wrong, but because they're gone. The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt full, loaded. Tucker swallowed. His pen was in his hand, but he hadn't written a word in the last 10 minutes. The index cards, in front of him, scribbled questions, pivot points, gotchas, sat untouched, dead artifacts of a performance that had lost its audience. Michelle leaned slightly forward. Not aggressive, not triumphant, just clear. This wasn't an interview. It was a reckoning. The air itself seemed to pull back. There was no response from Tucker Carlson. Not a nod, not a retort. His usual grin had slipped at some unknown moment and never returned. The red light above the main camera blinked twice, signaling a live feed still running. But the man who had once orchestrated millions of eyes didn't speak. He had prepared for debate. He had not prepared for elegy. He had not prepared for the truth that didn't blink. The studio had emptied fast. The buzz of equipment winding down, cables coiled, and lights dimming filled the space once alive with anticipation and tension. A single spotlight remained, steady and cold, trained on the empty anchor desk where Tucker Carlson had sat just hours before. The chair swiveled gently on its own, the faintest creak of its worn leather whispering the absence of a man suddenly made irrelevant. Behind the scenes, crew members moved with quiet purpose, gathering cameras and microphones, boxes of papers left scattered in their wake. The network issued a carefully worded statement, vague and non-committal, speaking of programming changes and evolving audience interests. But no one believed it was anything less than a reckoning, a reset triggered by a moment none could control. On every screen, Michelle Obama's final words from the broadcast repeated in slow, deliberate rhythm, the truth hanging heavy in the air. This wasn't an interview. It was a reckoning. Her voice, calm and unyielding, had cut deeper than any shouting match or hostile debate. She didn't just outsmart the questions posed to her, she transformed them, answering not with empty rhetoric, but with consequences. The country watched, and they remembered. He had tried to trap her in. Questions meant to corner and confine. She answered with history, with legacy, with the weight of truth.